Ethan liked the predictability of his life. There was comfort in the way mornings began. The low hum of the coffee machine, the faint scent of toast, the quiet shuffle of Clara moving between the kitchen and the dining table. Their home sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where most people had lived for years. The sidewalks were familiar, the same cracks and patches catching his eye on evening walks. Inside, the house was warm but not overly decorated, with small touches of Clara's taste scattered in framed photographs and the muted colors she preferred. They had been married for 8 years, long enough that their conversations sometimes moved in shorthand. A glance from her could tell him when she was tired, when she wanted to leave a party, when she was amused by something he said but didn't want to encourage his joke. Clara was not loud or overly affectionate in public, but she had a quiet steadiness that made Ethan feel anchored. Or at least, that's what he told himself. He worked in an architectural firm downtown, often returning home just after sunset. Clara had a part-time position at a local gallery, which allowed her afternoons free to cook or work on her own art. She painted, though rarely showed her pieces to anyone outside of a small circle. Sometimes, Ethan would find her in the spare room they called her studio, standing in front of a half-finished canvas, a smear of paint on her cheek, music low in the background. He liked those moments, the way she seemed entirely herself there. Yet, even in this quiet rhythm, Ethan noticed small gaps in their closeness. Some nights, she went to bed earlier than usual, claiming a headache. Other times, she seemed distracted, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the room when he spoke. If he asked, she would smile faintly and say she was just tired. He didn't press. They'd always respected each other's space. There were small changes over the years, as there are in any relationship. Clara's hair had been chestnut when they met. Now she kept it a deeper, almost black shade. She'd once hated strong perfume, but had started wearing a faint floral scent. Ethan thought little of it. Tastes shift, he reasoned. If he noticed her handwriting seemed more looping than before, he assumed it was simply a change in style. Their weekends were modest but pleasant. Saturday mornings were for errands, afternoons sometimes spent at the park with a thermos of coffee. Sundays often meant a slow breakfast and reading in the same room, each with their own book. Ethan took comfort in the idea that a good marriage didn't need constant excitement. Familiarity, he believed, was its own kind of love. One evening in late spring, they walked to a small restaurant they liked, the kind with dim lighting and an unhurried pace. Over dinner, Clara spoke about a new exhibit at the gallery, her hands gesturing lightly as she described the pieces. Ethan listened, enjoying the sound of her voice. On the way home, she slipped her arm through his, and they walked in silence for a few blocks. He thought about how easy it felt to be with her, even without words. Still, he couldn't ignore that sometimes, when he looked at her closely, there was a flicker in her expression, as if she were remembering something she wouldn't share. It wasn't distrust, exactly, but a distance he couldn't cross. He told himself that all couples had private corners of themselves, places even love couldn't reach. When Clara laughed, truly laughed, the kind that reached her eyes, Ethan felt everything between them was real and solid. And maybe that was why he let small doubts slide past him. A missed call she didn't mention. A name on a piece of mail he didn't recognize. A slight hesitation before answering a casual question. None of it seemed worth making into a fight. The house they shared carried their history. The paint they'd chosen together, the creak in the floor by the kitchen doorway, the dent in the wall from moving a bookshelf. To Ethan, these were markers of a life built side by side. In quiet moments, he would look at her and feel a kind of gratitude, the belief that he had found someone he could trust completely. There was nothing in those days to tell him that the woman he shared his life with was not the same woman he had married. No hint in her voice, no slip in her stories that felt like more than ordinary forgetfulness. If the truth was there, it was buried deep, beneath the everyday patterns and the comfort of routine. For Ethan, life with Clara was a steady line, not perfect, but whole. The idea that this line had been bent, broken, and rewoven by someone else had not yet entered his mind. The sun still rose in their quiet neighborhood, the coffee still brewed at the same hour, and Clara still moved through their mornings with the same measured grace he had always known. It would be years before he realized that the person beside him was not the woman he had promised his life to, and that every familiar detail had been carefully, almost flawlessly, imitated. For now, in this early chapter, the days felt safe. And Ethan, without knowing, lived inside a life built on someone else's shadow. It began with a simple errand on a quiet afternoon. Ethan stopped by the market on his way home, list in his pocket, thinking only about dinner and the email he needed to send later. The aisles were almost empty. He moved slowly, picking up a carton of eggs, a bunch of parsley, a loaf of bread. Near the end of the produce section, he saw Clara, or thought he did, on the far side of the apples, speaking with someone he didn't recognize. He smiled and started toward her, ready to tease her for beating him to the shopping. Before he reached them, the other woman laughed and said, "Isabel, you look exactly the same. I almost didn't believe it was you." Clara's back stiffened. Ethan stopped, just for a heartbeat. He watched Clara turn her head slightly, just enough to hide her mouth with her shoulder, and answer in a calm voice. "You must be confusing me with someone else." The woman frowned. "No, I'm sure. Isabel. From the summer program in Santa Fe. We shared a studio. You loved charcoal portraits and you hated tea. I think you're mixing memories," Clara replied. She smiled, a polite, distant smile, and extended a hand. "I'm Clara." The woman blinked, embarrassment flooding her face. She apologized, stumbled over a few warm words, and soon drifted toward the dairy aisle. Clara turned then and spotted Ethan. Her expression softened so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. "There you are," she said, as if he had always been part of the conversation. "I picked up lemons. They had good ones." Ethan nodded, but the name lingered. Isabel. He had heard it only once before, in a story Clara told years ago about a sister she no longer spoke to. He didn't bring it up right there, not with the soft market music playing and the light catching the polished apples like small suns. He kissed her cheek and joked about racing to the register. She laughed and said he could win this time. In the car, as the air cooled around them, he asked, "Who was that?" "Someone from ages ago," she said, buckling her seatbelt. "She thought I was another person." "It happens." He waited, hoping she would give more. When she didn't, he said lightly, "She called you Isabel." Clara adjusted the mirror, eyes on the road before she even started the engine. People forget names. Or they want to recognize someone and pull the wrong one from memory. I wouldn't read much into it. He didn't push. He wanted to believe her, wanted the moment to be nothing more than a misunderstanding. Yet a small splinter of doubt had settled somewhere he couldn't reach. It didn't hurt, not yet, but he felt it there. They ate dinner that night with the windows open. The sky turned a soft blue. She told him about a new artist at the gallery who welded found metal into abstract shapes. He told her a story from work about a client who wanted a staircase that looked like it was floating. The conversation moved as it always had, easy and familiar. If his mind drifted once or twice to the market, to the name hanging in the air between the apples, he kept it to himself. The next week, he found a note on the kitchen counter written in a hand that looked slightly different from the loops he was used to. The letters leaned more to the right, the lines a touch tighter. "Back by 5. Don't forget the keys." He stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Then he folded it and placed it under the salt cellar as if that could anchor it. One evening, as they watched a movie, a character ordered a drink Clara had always said she disliked. Without thinking, she murmured, "I love those," then blinked and added, I used to. Not anymore." He let it pass, because people change taste, because it was small, because love often chooses comfort over curiosity. They ran into the same woman again 2 weeks later, at a street fair. It was crowded and bright, stalls full of handmade jewelry and small batch candles. The woman spotted them near a booth of ceramic bowls and called out, then stopped herself. "Clara, sorry," she said, her voice careful now. "I keep mixing you up with someone I knew. You look so much like her." Clara smiled kindly. "It happens." The woman hesitated, then added, almost to herself, "It's uncanny." She offered a quick wave and slipped back into the flow of people. That night, Ethan stood at the sink washing dishes while Clara dried. He asked, as easily as he could, "Your sister. Do you ever talk to her?" "No," she said, setting a plate on the rack. Not for a very long time. Do you miss her? Clara paused. I miss the version of us that existed before everything got complicated. She turned to him, the dish towel twisted in her hands. Can we not do this tonight? Of course, he said, and meant it. He knew the difference between curiosity and prying, and he didn't want to be the person who turned pain into a puzzle. Still, small things continued to shift. She began wearing a delicate ring he had never seen, saying she'd found it in an old jewelry box. He noticed a photo in a frame on her desk replaced by another, similar pose, slightly different smile. He told himself these details were normal, the minor edits people make to their lives without meaning anything by it. He went to her gallery one afternoon, unannounced. She was on the floor, arranging postcards. A man at the counter greeted him and said, "Isabel will be right with you." Ethan turned, surprised, and saw Clara step from behind a partition, the gallery light making her hair glow. The man flushed when he saw Ethan's face. "I mean Clara. Sorry. She mentioned Isabel earlier, and I mixed it up." Clara gave a tight laugh. "All good," she said, then took Ethan's arm and guided him to the back, her grip a shade firmer than usual. Once they were alone, she said, "People hear what they want." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you mentioned your sister." "I might have," she replied. "I don't remember." She kissed him, quick and soft. "Let's go get lunch." On the walk, he tried to match the woman he knew to the one he doubted he knew. He catalogued her gestures, the way she touched the base of her throat when thinking, the way she leaned her head to listen, as if he could find the truth in muscle memory. But love complicates the simplest audit. For every odd detail, there were 100 familiar ones that felt unshakable. He began to dream in pairs. He would wake with the feeling that two figures had spoken to him in the night, and he couldn't tell which one he'd followed. He said nothing about this, because it sounded foolish even in his own head. A month after the market, he found her sorting old papers in the spare room. There were envelopes addressed to Clara with a last name she no longer used, and a thin folder labeled with a city they had never visited together. He asked what they were, and she said they were leftovers from years ago, things she should have thrown out. She dropped the folder into a bag for shredding with a finality that made conversation end. He started noticing how often people mistook her for someone else. At the pharmacy, the tech handed her a receipt with the wrong first name, and she laughed it off. At the coffee shop, the barista called out "is" before correcting herself and saying Clara. Each time, the air between them thinned just a little, as though the shared story of their life had torn along a seam and was being stitched closed again, slightly off-center. One evening, he stood beside her at the bathroom mirror while she removed her makeup. Up close, he studied the tiny scar near her eyebrow he had never paid much attention to. Had it always been there? He tried to recall. Memory failed him in that small way memories do, and the failure scared him more than he expected. "Everything okay?" she asked, catching his eyes in the glass. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how people change." She smiled faintly. "We do," she said. "We have to." He nodded and turned off the light. If someone had asked him then what was wrong, he could not have identified a single proof. It was more like a room he had known in the dark, feeling different when he reached for the light switch. The switch still there, the wall still there, but a step out of place. He kept walking as if nothing had shifted, trusting that familiarity would catch him if he stumbled. The day after, he opened a drawer looking for batteries and found a photograph tucked beneath a pack of old postcards. Two young women stood shoulder to shoulder, wind whipping their hair, their faces bright with the kind of closeness that can only come from shared beginnings. On the back, written in a careful hand, was a single word, "Sisters." He carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table. When Clara came in, she looked at the picture for a long time, then slid it back toward him. "That was a different life," she said softly. "Is she okay?" he asked. Clara's eyes flickered, then steadied. "I don't know," she answered. "I haven't known for years." He reached for her hand. She let him hold it. They stood like that for a while, the picture between them, the past like a shadow on the table. Ethan told himself that love means accepting what you can't fix and trusting what you can't prove. The market encounter faded into the blur of ordinary days, but the name remained somewhere in him like a note left ringing after the music had ended. Isabel. He didn't know yet that the sound would grow louder, that it would follow him into rooms and surface in conversations until it could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. For now, he folded the photograph and placed it back in the drawer, telling himself that not every question needs an answer today. The house held its familiar quiet. The coffee maker clicked on at the usual time. Clara moved through the rooms with her unhurried grace. And Ethan, trying to be the man he believed himself to be, steady, kind, patient, chose stillness over suspicion, unaware that the truth had already stepped over his threshold and made itself at home. Long before Ethan ever heard the name Isabel, two sisters had grown up in a small coastal town where the wind always smelled faintly of salt. Clara and Isabel were born minutes apart on a humid August morning, identical in features, but not in nature. From the start, their parents saw the differences in how they moved through the world. Clara was measured, even as a child. She would sit quietly with her books, trace her fingers along the spines, and choose her words with care. Isabel was quicker to laugh, quicker to speak, quicker to take what she wanted before anyone could tell her no. In school, teachers often mixed them up at first, but it didn't take long to tell them apart. Clara followed rules almost to the letter, completing assignments early, staying behind to help straighten desks. Isabel, with the same green eyes and dark hair, leaned on charm and improvisation, talking her way out of trouble with a grin. When they stood together, they looked like two halves of a whole, but their closeness had edges sharp enough to cut. Through adolescence, they were inseparable in the way twins often are. They shared clothes, secrets, late-night whispers in their bedroom while the house settled into sleep. But even then, moments of competition threaded through the bond. If Clara got a part in the school play, Isabel would roll her eyes and sign up for the debate team just to prove she could command attention too. When Isabel's paintings won a local art prize, Clara's congratulations were genuine but tinged with a quiet sadness she didn't voice. It was in their early 20s, after their parents had moved away, that the split began to show more clearly. Isabel had a way of sliding into other people's lives, not maliciously at first, but with a kind of restless hunger. She borrowed not just sweaters or books, but ideas, acquaintances, even turns of phrase. When Clara started dating a man she met at a photography class, Isabel made a point of sitting close to him at gatherings, her laughter louder than necessary. Clara pretended not to notice, until the day she couldn't anymore. The fight that ended them began over something small, an accusation that Isabel had lied about where she'd been one evening, but it quickly swelled, dredging up every old bruise. Clara accused her of betrayal, of crossing lines without caring who was hurt. Isabel countered that Clara lived too tightly wound, that she mistook caution for morality. In the heat of it, Clara said, "You don't know how to be anyone but a shadow of whoever's standing closest." Isabel's face hardened at that, the air between them going still. They didn't speak for months after. When they finally met in a cafe to try to repair things, it lasted less than 20 minutes. Isabel arrived late, unapologetic, and spent the first few minutes scrolling through her phone. Clara said she needed boundaries. Isabel said she needed to loosen her grip on everything. They left without hugging, their reflections briefly side by side in the cafe window before they turned in opposite directions. From then on, Clara kept her sister's name tucked away, mentioning her only if asked directly. She moved to the city, took a job at the gallery, built a life where Isabel's unpredictable gravity couldn't pull her off course. She never stopped thinking of her, though. When she saw two women in matching coats crossing the street, when she heard a laugh too similar to her own, when she caught her reflection in certain lights, Isabel was there, not in body, but in the echo of possibility. Isabel's path was harder to trace. Friends of friends mentioned she'd been in Europe for a while, then back in the States, living in a small apartment above a bar. She drifted through jobs, dated people she didn't introduce to family, and kept her phone number changing often enough that no one could pin her down for long. She sent Clara a postcard once with no return address, just a photograph of a lighthouse and the words "still here." Clara kept it in a drawer for a while, then one day threw it out without looking at it again. Years passed. The two of them grew into their 30s on separate tracks. The closeness of their youth thinned into something almost transparent. And yet, in ways neither admitted aloud, they carried each other. Clara sometimes wondered if Isabel had softened, if she'd learned the quiet joys of staying in one place, of letting someone truly know her. Isabel, in her own way, kept track of Clara through scraps of news and sightings, telling herself she could step back into her sister's world at any time if she wanted. But stepping back in would not be a gentle reunion. It would require slipping into the space Clara had made for herself, a space Isabel had once occupied in flashes of borrowed attention. Isabel had always been able to mimic her sister's posture, her voice, the tilt of her head when she was thinking. As children, they'd used it to play tricks on teachers, switching places just to see how long it took for someone to notice. Isabel never forgot how easy it had been. By the time Ethan met Clara, the sisters hadn't seen each other in years. He knew of Isabel only in passing, a name without a face, a ghost in Clara's history. Clara spoke of her once while they were sitting on the couch, saying simply, "We're not close anymore." He didn't ask why. He figured family rifts belonged to the people who lived them, not to those who heard about them secondhand. Somewhere else, Isabel was moving again, her belongings fitting into 2 suitcases, her eyes sharp to the details of new surroundings. She had learned how to become what was needed in any given moment, how to stand just so, how to answer without giving anything away. It was a skill and a shield, and she wore it like a second skin. The story of the sisters didn't pause just because they weren't speaking. It moved quietly beneath the surface, each making choices the other would never know about, until the day their paths would cross again, not in a cafe or on a holiday, but in a way that would bind them together for the last time. Ethan didn't know that this history existed in the woman who shared his bed. He only knew the version of Clara that had been presented to him, the one who painted in the afternoons and preferred her coffee black, the one who said she'd grown up by the sea. He didn't know that somewhere, a woman with the same eyes and the same hands was carrying the weight of a life that wasn't hers yet, but would be. And when she stepped into it, she would make sure that no one, least of all Ethan, could tell the difference. It happened so gradually that Ethan couldn't say when it truly began. Looking back, it would have been easier if there had been one sharp moment, a single incident to point to and say, "This is where things changed." But instead it came in small, almost invisible adjustments, each one too minor to cause alarm on its own. Together, though, they began to bend the shape of their life. Clara started wearing her hair differently. She claimed she was tired of the same look she'd had for years and wanted something that felt more like herself. At first, Ethan thought nothing of it. People change hairstyles all the time, but he caught himself staring at her in certain lights, wondering if it made her look older or simply different. Her choice in clothes shifted too. She traded soft sweaters and muted colors for sharper cuts, darker tones, pieces that looked like they belonged in a city fashion magazine. She said she found them on sale. It was the scent that struck him next. For years she'd avoided perfume altogether, saying it gave her headaches. Then one morning, she left for work smelling faintly of jasmine and bergamot. When he asked about it, she laughed and said the gallery had been gifted samples, and she'd just tried one. But the scent lingered for weeks, becoming as much a part of her presence as the sound of her voice. Her handwriting changed. It was subtle, but Ethan had seen her write enough grocery lists and sticky notes to notice that the loops in her letters had grown tighter, her slant a little more pronounced. When he teased her about it, she smiled and said maybe her hand just felt like moving differently now. Conversations with friends began to dwindle. People they used to see regularly seemed to vanish from their calendar. If he suggested calling them, Clara would say they were probably busy or that she wasn't in the mood for company. Instead, she brought home new acquaintances he'd never met before, people who seemed to know her well, but not at all, as though they'd been given the outline of her life, but not the details. Ethan started noticing the late-night phone calls. They came once or twice a week, always after he'd gone to bed. He would wake to the murmur of her voice in another room, low and deliberate, as if she were speaking in a language only she and the person on the other end could understand. When he asked who it was, she'd say it was a friend from the gallery with a complicated love life. He wanted to believe that. Her tastes shifted in ways that were harder to dismiss. Foods she'd once disliked began appearing in their meals. Olives in the salad, strong cheese on the counter, tea instead of coffee some mornings. She claimed she was just experimenting, that it was good to try new things, but Ethan couldn't shake the sense that he was living beside someone who was quietly rearranging her own identity. One night, they argued. It started with something trivial. He had forgotten to take the trash out. She had moved his tools from the hall closet, but it swelled into something else. She accused him of watching her too closely, of turning every change into a suspicion. He told her he just wanted to understand. Understand what? She asked, her voice sharp. That people grow? That I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. After that, he tried to stop noticing. Or at least, to stop letting her see that he noticed. He told himself it was normal for people to evolve, that marriages could survive shifts as long as the foundation stayed intact. But late at night, he found himself studying her face in the dark, as if comparing it to a picture only he could see in his mind, looking for differences he couldn't quite name. There were moments when the changes seemed to pause. She would reach for his hand while they walked, or curl up beside him on the couch with her head against his shoulder. Those moments felt like proof that whatever distance he sensed was imagined, that she was still the same Clara. But then something else would happen, a stranger waving to her from across the street, calling her by a name he didn't recognize, a hesitation before answering a question about her past, and the ground beneath him would tilt again. One afternoon, he came home early and found her in the kitchen, going through a drawer she rarely opened. There were papers spread out, old letters, receipts, photographs. But when she saw him, she swept them into a folder and said she was just cleaning up. Later, he realized he'd never seen that folder again. He began to feel as though he was living with two versions of the same woman, the one he recognized from years of shared life, and another who existed in glances, in unfamiliar habits, in moments when she seemed almost like a stranger wearing his wife's face. When friends asked how they were, he smiled and said, "Good," because it was easier than explaining the unease that couldn't be pinned to a single fact. In photographs, they still looked like the same couple they'd always been, but Ethan had started to understand that a photograph only captured the surface. What lay beneath could be shifting in ways the lens would never catch. The changes were never enough to demand confrontation, but always enough to unsettle. A word here, a choice there, an absence of something that had once been constant. He told himself not to jump to conclusions, that the mind could invent patterns where none existed. But sometimes, lying beside her at night, he felt like he was standing in a room where the furniture had been moved ever so slightly, not enough to notice at first, but enough that when he reached for what should be there, his hand found only empty space. It was a Thursday night in early autumn, one of those evenings when the air feels sharper than the day before, as if the season has quietly shifted without warning. The street outside their house was still, the windows along the block glowing softly. Ethan was at home, half distracted by paperwork on the dining table, the television murmuring in the background. Clara had been out most of the day, saying she had errands and a late appointment at the gallery. When she walked through the door just after 9, she seemed tense in a way that had no single cause. Her eyes alert but unfocused, her movements brisk, almost too precise. He asked if she'd eaten. She shook her head and said she wasn't hungry. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter, drinking it in small sips while staring at nothing in particular. There was a stillness to her that Ethan had felt before but never understood, as if she were waiting for something to happen and was already bracing for it. They spoke little. He gathered his papers. She disappeared into the bedroom for a while. When she returned, she wore a sweater he didn't recognize, dark, heavy, with sleeves that almost covered her hands. She said she was going to take a short walk to clear her head. He offered to go with her, but she declined. The way she smiled when she said it felt rehearsed, like a line she'd spoken before. Ethan returned to the table, trying to focus on his work. The house seemed unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. He was about to get up and put on music when the front door opened again. But it wasn't Clara. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded jacket. Ethan froze, thinking at first he was in the wrong house. Then the man's eyes fixed on him, sharp and unblinking, and Ethan knew this was no mistake. "What?" Ethan began, but the man moved quickly, pulling something from inside his jacket. Ethan's instinct was to back away, but he barely had time before the man crossed the space between them. The first blow came fast, a heavy crack against the side of his head that sent him stumbling into the wall. His vision swam, the edges of the room going dark. Somewhere, distantly, he heard Clara's voice. It wasn't the panic cry he expected, but a sharp, urgent command. Stop! The sound cut through the ringing in his ears. The man hesitated, glancing toward her. In that frozen second, Ethan tried to focus, tried to understand why she sounded less afraid than he was. Then came the gunshot. One sharp, deafening note that seemed to pull all the air from the room. Ethan felt himself sink to the floor, his body heavy, his mind struggling to keep hold of the moment. He saw Clara, or maybe it was just the shape of her, standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but unreadable. The man was gone. The door was open. Cold air poured in from the street. Ethan's vision narrowed. He saw her move toward the kitchen, kneeling beside a figure on the floor. It took him a long second to understand that there was another person there, someone lying still. He thought it must be a neighbor, or maybe the intruder. Then the light caught the face, and something deep in him recoiled. It was her face. Clara's face. The world tilted. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He saw her, the woman who had been standing in their kitchen moments before, leaning over the body, touching the side of the face as if trying to wipe away something that couldn't be removed. Voices filled the air outside, a neighbor shouting, footsteps on the sidewalk, the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Clara, or the woman who had been Clara, stood and stepped back, her expression unreadable. She glanced toward Ethan, just for a second, something flickering in her eyes. Then she moved away from the body, toward the front of the house. The police arrived in a rush of heavy boots and clipped commands. Hands guided Ethan up and out of the room, into the cool night air. He was lowered onto the steps, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Questions swirled, but his head throbbed too much to form answers. Through the open door, he saw the paramedics kneeling by the body in the kitchen, their movements quick but already edged with the futility of ritual. Someone asked him if he knew the victim. The question cut through the fog in his mind. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. How could he explain that the woman inside looked exactly like his wife, yet his wife had been standing across the room when the shot was fired? They led him to the ambulance, the sirens now silent. As they closed the doors, he caught one last glimpse of the house. The front door still open, lights spilling onto the lawn, the street beyond already gathering quiet onlookers. He thought of the evening as it had started, the ordinary rhythm of it, and how quickly that rhythm had been broken beyond repair. Later, in the hospital, he would try to replay the moments in order to understand who had come through the door first, who had pulled the trigger, who had been lying on the floor. But the images shifted each time, as if his memory itself couldn't decide what to believe. The only constant was the face that belonged to his wife and to someone else entirely. The hospital lights felt colder than the night outside. Ethan lay on the bed, a bandage wrapped tight around his head, the steady beep of a monitor marking time he could no longer measure. He drifted between clarity and a fog that swallowed whole minutes. Sometimes a nurse's voice cut through it. Sometimes the sound of footsteps moving past the doorway brought him up to the surface. But most of the time, it was just the quiet and the replay of images he couldn't make sense of, the open door, the stranger's shoulders filling the frame, the gunshot, and the face that shouldn't have been there twice. Detective Mara Levin appeared the next morning, her expression steady, her gaze direct. She stood at the foot of his bed with a small notebook in her hand, as though the conversation had already begun and she was just letting him catch up. She was in her 40s, with short hair tucked neatly behind her ears and a voice that carried a calm weight. "Mr. Alden," she said, "I'm sorry for what happened. I need to ask you some questions about last night." He told her what he could, though it felt like handing over fragments of a shattered photograph. The man at the door. Clara's voice. The sudden gunshot. The body on the kitchen floor. He hesitated before describing the face, not because he doubted what he saw, but because he didn't know how to put it into words without sounding like he'd lost his grasp on reality. "Detective," he said finally, The woman who was killed, she looked exactly like my wife. But my wife was there too. Across the room. Levin didn't flinch. You're sure? As sure as I can be about anything right now. She nodded once, wrote something down, and told him they'd be running an identification on the victim as soon as possible. When she left, she didn't look like someone who thought he was imagining things. That steadied him more than he expected. By the afternoon, the house was sealed with yellow tape. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, their voices low, eyes darting toward the front door as if the truth might walk out on its own. Inside, forensic techs moved methodically, photographing the scene from every angle, collecting shell casings, bagging evidence. In the kitchen, the floor still bore the mark of where the body had been, a dark shadow against the tile. Detective Levin returned to Ethan's room that evening. She stood for a moment before speaking, as though weighing how much to tell him. The woman in your kitchen had no identification on her, she said, but she had a scar above her right brow. Does that sound familiar? Ethan frowned. He thought of the faint mark he'd noticed on Clara weeks earlier, the one he couldn't remember seeing before. Yes, he said slowly. My wife has that. Or, I thought she did. Your wife, Levin said carefully, hasn't been located. We've checked the gallery, her friends, her usual routes. No one's seen her since yesterday morning. The words landed with a weight that seemed to push the air from his chest. Then who? That's what we're going to find out. The next day brought more questions than answers. A set of fingerprints taken from the victim's hands came back with no match in the system, but prints lifted from around the house, glasses in the kitchen, the doorknob to the bedroom, didn't all match either. Some belonged to Ethan, some to Clara, and some to someone else entirely. Levin visited again, bringing with her a photograph printed on glossy paper. This was found in a box in your bedroom closet, she said. It was the same image Ethan had seen weeks ago, two women, wind in their hair, their faces so alike they might have been mirrors. On the back was a name, Isabel. He told Levin what little he knew, which wasn't much. Clara had a twin sister. They hadn't spoken in years. He'd never met her. She'd never visited their home. Levin listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily. The medical examiner's preliminary report came the next morning. The victim had been shot at close range. Time of death placed it minutes before the police arrived. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she hadn't expected the attack. And then came the detail that made Ethan's blood run cold. The victim's dental records, pulled from an old clinic file, matched those of Isabel Hart, age 38. So it was Isabel in his kitchen. Isabel who had been in his home, wearing Clara's face. The realization cracked open a space in his mind he didn't know existed. How long had she been there? Days? Weeks? Longer? And where was Clara now? Detective Levin began piecing together a timeline. Witnesses reported seeing Clara at the gallery as recently as last week. Others said she'd been acting more social lately, talking to people she hadn't engaged with before. A few mentioned a man who came by once or twice, tall, wearing a hooded jacket. No one knew his name. The investigation widened. Calls were made to other cities, requests sent for records, for photographs, for anything that could place either sister in a verifiable location. Ethan was asked to look through dozens of images, but each time, the line between recognition and uncertainty blurred until his head ached. At night, in the hospital bed, he replayed his memories with new suspicion. Every strange habit, every slip in detail, every moment he'd explained away. What if they had all been the signs of Isabel stepping into Clara's life? The thought hollowed him out, because if that was true, then he had been living beside a lie so seamless it had fooled not only his friends and neighbors but himself. Levin didn't offer false comfort. She spoke plainly, her voice even, as if truth needed no decoration. If your wife is out there, we'll find her. But you need to prepare yourself for all possibilities. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what all possibilities really meant. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the hospital's white walls, the city kept moving. Cars sliding down wet streets, storefront lights blinking out for the night, strangers passing each other without a glance. And in the middle of it, there was the absence of Clara and the presence of a sister who had taken her place until violence made the deception impossible to hide. The case was no longer just about a murder in his kitchen. It was about the life that had been dismantled quietly, piece by piece, until the truth could only reveal itself in blood. And now, the search for that truth had begun in earnest. Ethan was released from the hospital 3 days after the shooting. The autumn air felt different now, sharper, heavier, as if the city itself had absorbed what had happened and was holding it in its bones. The police drove him home because his head injury made them uneasy about letting him navigate the streets alone. Detective Levin walked with him up the front steps, her gaze scanning the houses across the way as though answers might be hiding in their windows. Inside, the air was faint with the scent of cleaning agents, the kind that erased not just dirt but any trace of what came before. The kitchen floor gleamed under the light. The yellow tape was gone, but the absence in the space where Isabel's body had lain was louder than any mark could be. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the sound of the refrigerator filling the silence, before Levin asked him if he was ready to talk about Clara. He didn't know how to explain the feeling he had, that she was both impossibly far away and somewhere close enough to hear him if he called her name. Levin's questions were steady, methodical. When had he last seen her without doubt? What had she said? What had she been wearing? Ethan tried to answer, but each detail felt slippery. The memory of her was tangled now with the memory of Isabel, the way they could inhabit the same space in his mind and leave him unsure which one he was seeing. Over the next week, the investigation into Clara's disappearance deepened. Phone records showed her number had gone dark the morning of the day Isabel died. Bank accounts sat untouched. The gallery confirmed she hadn't been in for days before the shooting, though Clara had still been seen in the neighborhood. Neighbors swore they'd waved to her, exchanged a hello. Ethan wondered how many times he'd done the same, thinking he was talking to his wife. Levin brought in a specialist who dealt with cases involving assumed identities. He was a quiet man with a soft voice, and he explained that taking over another person's life wasn't always as dramatic as people imagined. It happens in the margins, he said. Small substitutions. Details altered one at a time until the replacement feels natural to everyone involved. Ethan felt a cold recognition at that. The search spread outward. Clara's photograph was circulated to bus stations, airports, and border checkpoints. Tips came in, most of them dead ends. A woman who looked like her in a motel lobby 3 towns over, another on a ferry heading north. Each time, Ethan waited for Levin's call, heart caught between hope and dread, only to hear that it wasn't her. At night, he found himself wandering the house, opening closets and drawers as though she might have left behind a message he'd overlooked. Once, he found an envelope tucked behind a stack of cookbooks. Inside was a receipt from a diner in a town he'd never heard of, dated months earlier, signed with the name Isabel. He brought it to Levin the next morning. She examined it, said it might be nothing, but bagged it anyway. Friends began calling, their voices full of concern, their questions looping back to the same unanswerable point. Do you think she's alive? Ethan could never give them more than, I don't know. Some offered theories, that she'd run away, that she'd been taken, each one plausible and impossible in its own way. In quieter moments, he replayed scenes from their life together, searching for signs he'd missed. He thought about the night she'd told him she was going for a walk, the sweater he didn't recognize, the way her smile hadn't reached her eyes. He thought about the times she'd turned from a question, her gaze sliding to the side as though measuring the distance to something unseen. Levin kept him close to the case without drowning him in it. She called every other day, sometimes with an update, sometimes just to check on him. Once she told him plainly, if she's alive, she may not want to be found. That's something we have to consider. The thought lodged in him like a splinter. The media caught wind of the twin element, and suddenly there were reporters on the sidewalk, their lenses hungry for the house, for him, for a glimpse of a woman who might be one's sister or the other. Headlines traded in speculation. Twin deception ends in murder. Husband lived with wife's sister. Ethan stopped reading after the first week, but he couldn't avoid the way strangers' eyes lingered when he went out. One afternoon, Levin arrived with a thin folder. Inside was a grainy security camera still from a rest stop 2 hours south. A woman with Clara's build, her hair pulled back, wearing a jacket Ethan had never seen. She was walking with a man whose face was turned away. The timestamp was from 2 days before the shooting. Is this her? Levin asked. He studied the image, but the blur between what he knew and what he thought he knew had grown too wide. I don't know, he said, and hated himself for it. Weeks passed. The days folded into each other, each one marked by the same absence. Levin told him they were keeping the case active, that sometimes people turned up months later in places no one had thought to look. But Ethan could feel the edges of the search fraying, the urgency softening into something slower, more resigned. In the house, her presence lingered in strange ways. A hair caught in the bristles of a brush, a half-empty bottle of shampoo, the faint scent of jasmine that clung to the collar of a coat. He didn't move these things. They felt like the only proof left that she had been here, that she might still come back. But every so often, in the quiet just before sleep, he would feel certain she was gone for good. Not because of the investigation, not because of the unanswered questions, but because somewhere deep down, he knew that if Clara had been able to return, she would have, unless the woman he had loved was not the same woman he'd been living with at the end. And if that was true, then the person he was waiting for no longer existed in the way he remembered. The search went on, but it no longer felt like a straight line. It was a spiral, circling around the same mysteries, returning again and again to the night of the murder, to the moment when two faces became one and then neither. And in that spiral, the hope of finding her became tangled with the fear of what the truth might actually be. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in small, jagged fragments, each one cutting at a different angle, never enough to make the whole picture, but sharp enough to change it. Weeks after the shooting, Ethan had learned to stop expecting clarity in a single conversation. Instead, he pieced together what Levin told him, what she didn't say, and what surfaced in the spaces between. The first fragment came from a phone call one early morning. Levin's voice was quiet, almost flat, as if she didn't want her words to carry too far. A witness had come forward, a truck driver who remembered picking up a woman on the edge of a highway, miles from the city, days before the murder. She'd said her name was Clara, but the driver noticed the way she avoided eye contact, the way she kept asking about towns in the opposite direction from where they were heading. The man hadn't thought much of it until he saw her face in a news clip on the diner's television. By then, she was gone. The second fragment arrived in the form of an envelope pushed through Ethan's mail slot with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on cheap paper. It showed Clara, unmistakably her, standing in front of a small motel, her hair loose, wearing jeans and a plain white shirt. She wasn't looking at the camera. Behind her, a shadow stretched across the parking lot, suggesting someone else had been there. On the back was nothing but a date from 2 weeks before the shooting. Levin took the photo, her jaw tightening. She said they would check the motel, but Ethan could hear in her voice that she didn't expect much. Then came the third fragment, a bank withdrawal made from an account Ethan didn't know existed, in Clara's name, but opened in another state. The withdrawal was small, enough to avoid attention, but the signature matched hers perfectly. Levin explained that it was possible Isabel had made it, but the timeline didn't quite fit. The account had activity from years earlier, around the time Clara had told Ethan she'd been working extra hours at the gallery to save for a trip they never took. As the pieces collected, Ethan began to see how easily one life could slip into another. The sisters' resemblance wasn't just in their faces. It was in the way they could move through the same spaces, where the same expressions carry the same fragments of shared history. Isabel could use Clara's name and smile in the same shape, and most people wouldn't think to question it. Clara, if she wanted, could just as easily become Isabel in the eyes of someone who didn't know either well enough to tell. One afternoon, Levin arrived with something different in her voice, not certainty, but direction. She said they had reason to believe Clara had been in contact with Isabel in the weeks before the murder. Phone records showed calls from an unlisted number traced to a prepaid cell purchased in cash. The calls were short, all under 2 minutes, but they happened late at night, when Ethan was asleep. Whatever happened that night, Levin said, started before the man with the hood walked into your house. That was the first time Ethan let himself consider that Clara's absence might have been a choice. The thought turned over in his mind like a coin, catching different light each time. If she had chosen to vanish, then the woman he'd been waiting for was not lost but gone by design. And if that was true, what had her final days in their home meant? Was she already preparing to leave? Already letting Isabel step in? The last fragment came from the coroner's office. Among Isabel's belongings was a key to a storage unit rented under a false name. Inside, they found two suitcases, one filled with clothes that matched Clara's style perfectly, the other with documents, utility bills, rental agreements, even a driver's license with Clara's photograph but Isabel's name. It was a life half-built, ready to be stepped into at a moment's notice. Ethan held one of the documents in his hands, feeling the weight of paper that shouldn't exist. It was proof, but proof of what? That Isabel had intended to take Clara's place? Or that Clara had given her the tools to do it? Levin didn't speculate, but the look in her eyes told him she had her own theories. At home that night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the background. He thought about the years with Clara, the quiet breakfasts, the walks at dusk, the way she would lean against him when they read in the same room. He thought about the first time he noticed her handwriting change, the unfamiliar sweater, the new perfume. He thought about the way she had smiled that last night, a smile that seemed to carry something she wasn't saying. The pieces were there, scattered across timelines and places and names. But fitting them together meant accepting that the woman he had loved might have been someone else by the end, not just in face, but in intention. The truth was no longer a single point he could reach for. It was a mosaic of moments, each one carrying its own weight, its own possibility. And in that mosaic, there was still room for her to be both victim and architect, missing and gone, lost and free. Ethan didn't know if he wanted the rest of the pieces, because once the whole picture came into view, he would have to stop wondering and start living with the answer. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a silence that seemed to settle deeper than usual. Snow covered the streets in a clean, unbroken layer, muting the sounds of traffic and footsteps. Ethan moved through the days in a rhythm that felt foreign, as if someone had rearranged the seasons themselves. The house was warmer than the air outside, but it felt no less empty. Detective Levin still called, though the intervals between those calls had stretched. The case was technically open, but the tone in her voice made it clear that the sharp edge of urgency had dulled. Leads were followed, but most faded quickly. A woman with Clara's build was spotted in a train station 3 states away. Another was seen buying groceries in a coastal town. Each sighting carried a flicker of hope that burned out as soon as details failed to match. Ethan no longer tried to predict when news might come. Instead, he lived in the space between waiting and moving on, unsure which would feel like a betrayal. He spent hours sorting through old photographs, not to study faces for clues, but to remember what life had looked like before he began questioning every detail. In one picture, Clara stood at the edge of a lake, her hair pulled back, laughing at something just out of frame. He stared at it until the lines blurred, and he could almost believe that nothing had gone wrong. One evening, a package arrived with no return address. It was small, light, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a folded scarf he recognized, a deep green one Clara used to wear in winter, and beneath it, a slip of paper with a single line written in her handwriting, "I was never lost." The words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples in all directions. He read them again and again, searching for hidden meaning, wondering if they were meant as comfort, warning, or something else entirely. When he showed Levin, she studied the note for a long time before saying, "It's her handwriting, no doubt, but there's no way to trace where it came from." The scarf carried her faint scent, something floral and light, and Ethan found himself holding it longer than he intended. It was proof she was alive, proof she was somewhere, and also proof she had chosen not to be found. That knowledge both steadied and hollowed him. The days grew shorter, the light fading before he had fully registered afternoon. In the evenings, he would sit by the front window, the street lamp casting long shadows across the snow, and watch the occasional figure pass by. Sometimes he imagined he would see her, walking quickly, head down, not looking toward the house, but close enough for him to know. Levin came by once more in person, not with evidence, but with something closer to advice. She told him that cases like this didn't always end with an arrest or a body. Sometimes they simply unraveled until there was nothing left to hold on to but the unanswered questions. It's not closure, she said. It's just the rest of your life. After she left, Ethan walked through the house slowly, touching the edges of furniture, the door frames, the walls. Each room still carried her shape in some way. The cup she used to drink from was still in the cupboard. Her coat still hung by the door. These were not relics of someone who had been taken. They were the traces of someone who had walked away on her own. The snow kept falling. On the coldest night of the season, Ethan stepped outside and stood in the yard, the sound of the city reduced to a distant hum. He thought about the years they had shared, about the mornings and evenings that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt like the truest part of their story. He thought about the moment in the kitchen when he had seen her face twice and realized he had been living in a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Somewhere out there, she was living another life, maybe under her own name, maybe not. She might be walking along a beach in the pale winter light, or sitting in a diner with coffee she'd never finish, or riding a bus toward a place she'd decided to call home. She might think of him. She might not. The scarf remained on the table for weeks. Sometimes he would fold it carefully and put it away, only to take it out again the next day. It wasn't the object itself that mattered, but what it represented, the fact that she had reached out in her own way, that she had wanted him to know she was somewhere beyond the edges of his search. In time, Ethan learned to carry the uncertainty without letting it crush him. He went back to work. He saw friends again, even if the conversations felt thinner than before. He began to mark the passing of days without waiting for a phone call or a knock at the door. But he never stopped looking, not entirely. Every crowded street, every station platform, every cafe became a place where she might appear, if only for a moment. And on certain nights, when the snow fell softly and the world seemed to hold its breath, he would catch himself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see her walking toward the house. Not because he believed she was coming back, but because some part of him knew that even in her absence, she had never truly left.